On the night Michael Jackson died, something happened that has never fully settled into a clear and complete explanation. For years, countless documentaries, interviews, court records, and investigations attempted to piece together those final hours. Yet despite the mountains of information available, one strange reality remains. The closer people look at that night, the more questions seem to appear. This wasn't just the death of a famous singer. It was the sudden end of one of the most recognizable people on Earth. A man who had spent decades living under extraordinary levels of public attention. A performer whose every move generated headlines. A figure surrounded by bodyguards, assistants, managers, doctors, family members, business partners, and an entire industry built around his name. Yet when the final chapter arrived, confusion seemed to overwhelm certainty. The story begins during what should have been one of the greatest comebacks in entertainment history. After years of controversy, financial pressure, and constant media scrutiny, Michael Jackson was preparing for a massive return to the stage. The planned concert series promised to be unlike anything audiences had seen before. Tickets disappeared almost instantly. Fans from around the world made travel plans. Industry insiders predicted record-breaking revenue. For many supporters, this was supposed to be redemption. The return of the king of pop. Behind the scenes, however, a different picture was slowly emerging. Rehearsals were intense, expectations were enormous, every detail was being scrutinized. The production required extraordinary physical and mental commitment. As deadlines approached, concerns reportedly began surfacing among people close to the operation. Some described exhaustion, others mentioned mounting pressure. Later suggested that Michael seemed trapped between his desire to deliver perfection and the reality of what his body could handle. But nobody outside that inner circle knew exactly what was happening. To the public, everything appeared to be moving forward. Then came June 25, 2009. Within hours, the world would receive shocking news that seemed impossible to process. Michael Jackson was gone. Television networks interrupted programming. Radio stations changed schedules. Websites crashed under unprecedented traffic. Fans gathered outside hospitals, homes, and landmarks, hoping for answers. The initial shock was overwhelming, yet almost immediately, confusion followed. How could someone preparing for a global concert series suddenly die? Why were reports from that day often inconsistent? Who had been present during the final hours? And, perhaps most importantly, what exactly happened inside the house that morning? As investigators began reconstructing the timeline, details emerged that only deepened public fascination. Phone calls, medical treatments, last-minute decisions, contradictory accounts, missing clarity. Every new revelation seemed to answer one question while creating three more. Even years later, certain moments remain heavily debated. Witnesses remembered events differently. Timelines appeared difficult to reconcile. Experts disagreed about critical decisions made in the hours leading up to the tragedy. What should have become a straightforward historical record instead evolved into a puzzle that people continue examining more than a decade later. And at the center of that puzzle sits a single night. A night filled with rehearsals, private conversations, medical interventions, and choices that would permanently alter music history. The deeper investigators looked into those final hours, the stranger the story became. Because what happened next would reveal a chain of events so unusual that many people still struggle to understand how it unfolded at all. The final day of Michael Jackson's life did not begin with obvious signs of catastrophe. In many ways, it appeared similar to several days that had come before it. Preparations for the upcoming concert series were consuming nearly every aspect of his schedule. The shows represented far more than a collection of performances. They carried enormous financial expectations, professional pressure, and emotional significance. For Michael, this was an opportunity to prove that he could still command a stage the way few entertainers in history ever had. The rehearsals reflected that ambition. Those involved in the production later described an operation functioning at an extraordinary scale. Dancers, musicians, technicians, costume designers, choreographers, and executives were all working toward a single goal. Every movement, every lighting cue, and every musical transition was being refined repeatedly. Nothing was left to chance. Yet beneath the polished appearance of preparation, concerns were beginning to circulate. Some members of the production team reportedly noticed moments when Michael appeared unusually tired. Others recalled periods when he seemed withdrawn or physically fragile. While no major alarm publicly sounded at the time, stories that surfaced later painted a picture of someone carrying immense burdens behind the scenes. The challenge was that Michael Jackson had spent much of his life performing through discomfort. For decades, audiences had seen perfection. They rarely saw exhaustion. They rarely saw vulnerability. And they almost never saw the private struggles hidden behind the image. As the concert dates drew closer, expectations only intensified. Promoters had invested enormous resources. Venues were booked. Fans had purchased tickets months in advance. Delays or cancellations would create massive financial consequences. The pressure was relentless. According to accounts that emerged later, sleep had become an increasingly important issue. Rest should have been simple. Instead, it reportedly became one of the biggest obstacles facing the star. Night after night, the ability to recover physically and mentally was becoming more difficult. For a performer expected to deliver lengthy live shows involving complex choreography, that problem carried serious implications. But at the time, few people outside a small circle understood the extent of the situation. What the public did see was a performer still preparing for his return. One rehearsal in particular would later attract enormous attention. Footage from the evening before his death showed Michael practicing songs, moving across the stage, and working alongside his creative team. To many viewers who watched the recordings afterward, he appeared engaged and focused. Some even described him as energized. That observation would later become one of the most puzzling aspects of the entire story. How could someone capable of rehearsing one evening be gone less than 24 hours later? The question fueled endless debate. Supporters pointed to the footage as evidence that disaster seemed impossible to predict. Critics argued that appearances could be deceiving. Investigators would eventually spend years examining every available detail. As darkness fell after the rehearsal ended, Michael returned home. For most people, that moment would have passed without significance. But in hindsight, it marked the beginning of the timeline that would be analyzed over and over again. Inside the residence, only a small number of individuals truly knew what was happening. The world outside remained unaware. Fans were discussing upcoming concerts. Media outlets were covering the anticipated comeback. Business partners were calculating future profits. Nobody realized that the final hours of Michael Jackson's life had already begun. And according to the accounts that would emerge later, what happened inside that house throughout the night would become the center of one of the most scrutinized investigations in entertainment history. Because somewhere between the end of rehearsal and the following morning, events began unfolding that would forever change the story. As the evening transitioned into night, the atmosphere surrounding Michael Jackson's final hours became increasingly difficult to reconstruct with certainty. Investigators would later discover that what appeared simple on the surface was anything but. The challenge wasn't a lack of information. It was the overwhelming amount of conflicting information. Over the years, witness statements, phone records, testimony, and medical evidence created a timeline that seemed complete in some places and frustratingly unclear in others. Certain events could be verified with precision, others remained trapped behind differing recollections and unanswered questions. Inside the house, preparations for rest reportedly became the primary focus. That alone was not unusual. What made the situation extraordinary was the importance attached to sleep that night. Michael was facing another demanding day connected to the concert preparations. Rehearsals were continuing. Expectations were growing. The pressure to remain physically capable of carrying the production forward had not disappeared. If anything, it had intensified. According to later accounts, attempts were made to help him sleep. At first glance, that detail may seem insignificant, but it would eventually become one of the most discussed elements of the entire case. As investigators pieced together the sequence of events, they learned that the night stretched on longer than expected. Hours passed. The desired result reportedly failed to arrive. Instead of restful sleep, there appeared to be mounting frustration. For someone already under immense pressure, the inability to rest could quickly become more than an inconvenience. It could affect judgment, energy, focus, decision-making. And with an enormous concert commitment looming ahead, every lost hour carried additional weight. Yet, this is where the story begins to grow more complicated. Years later, experts examining the case would debate not only what occurred, but why certain decisions were made in response to the situation. Some argued that extraordinary circumstances had created extraordinary choices. Others insisted that critical boundaries should never have been crossed, regardless of the circumstances. The disagreement never fully disappeared. Meanwhile, outside the residence, life continued normally. Los Angeles remained awake. Traffic moved through the city. News organizations focused on other stories. Millions of fans around the world had no idea that events were unfolding which would soon dominate global headlines. Inside the house, however, the situation was reportedly becoming increasingly serious. At various points during the investigation, attention focused on communications made throughout the night and early morning. Phone activity, schedules, and witness recollections became essential pieces of the puzzle. Each detail seemed capable of changing the interpretation of what happened, but every answer produced additional uncertainty. One witness remembered events one way, another remembered them differently. Some timelines appeared straightforward until examined closely. Others seemed difficult to reconcile from the very beginning. This uncertainty created an unusual problem. Normally, major historical events eventually settle into a broadly accepted narrative. Michael Jackson's final hours never entirely did. Instead, they became a subject of ongoing examination. Documentaries revisited the evidence. Journalists reviewed testimony. Medical professionals analyzed decisions. Fans searched for explanations, and still, the complete picture remained elusive. Then came the early morning hours. This was the period investigators would later identify as the most critical portion of the timeline. The margin for error had effectively disappeared. Every action now carried enormous consequences. What happened next would become the focus of courtrooms, news reports, and public debate across the globe. The details emerging from those crucial hours would shock millions of people and eventually place one individual at the center of an international controversy. Because by sunrise, the situation inside the house had moved far beyond concerns about sleep. A medical emergency was beginning to unfold, and the response to that emergency would raise questions that continue to be discussed to this day. As morning approached, the situation inside the residence entered the phase that would later define the entire story. What had reportedly begun as another attempt to help Michael Jackson rest was now transforming into something far more serious. The most troubling aspect was how quickly the timeline seemed to shift. Investigators would later examine minute-by-minute sequences, trying to determine exactly when concern should have become alarm and when alarm should have become emergency action. Those distinctions would eventually become central to court proceedings, expert testimony, and years of public debate. At some point during the morning, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. Yet even this seemingly simple fact carried layers of uncertainty. Questions emerged almost immediately. How long had the crisis been developing? When was it first recognized? Who understood the severity of the situation, and most importantly, were critical opportunities lost during those crucial moments? As emergency responders would later discover, the answers were not straightforward. The timeline that emerged was filled with details that investigators found difficult to ignore. Phone records attracted particular attention. Calls made during key periods became subjects of intense scrutiny. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, journalists, and independent analysts all examined the sequence repeatedly. Every minute seemed to matter. To some observers, the records suggested confusion. To others, they suggested delay, and to still others, they represented the chaotic reality of a rapidly unfolding medical crisis. The problem was that no interpretation completely eliminated the lingering questions. Meanwhile, inside the house, efforts were reportedly being made to respond to the emergency. But by this point, events were moving toward a tragic outcome. When emergency personnel eventually arrived, they entered a scene that would later be described and dissected in extraordinary detail. Every observation became part of the official record. The arrival of paramedics should have marked the beginning of clarity. Instead, it became another source of controversy. Accounts of what responders encountered generated additional debate. Medical professionals reviewing the circumstances years later would continue discussing whether certain actions aligned with accepted emergency procedures and whether earlier intervention might have changed the outcome. These discussions were not merely academic. They formed the foundation of one of the most consequential investigations involving a celebrity death in modern history. As news began filtering outward, the outside world remained largely unaware of the full gravity of the situation. Rumors appeared first. Unconfirmed reports followed. Then speculation spread across media networks and online communities. Few people knew what to believe. The information arriving from different sources was inconsistent. Some reports suggested improvement. Others hinted at catastrophe. For several hours, uncertainty dominated the conversation. Then came the announcement that changed everything. Michael Jackson was dead. The reaction was immediate and unprecedented. Around the globe, people struggled to process what they had heard. Television stations interrupted regular programming. Radio broadcasters abandoned scheduled content. Websites experienced surges of traffic unlike anything they had previously encountered. Crowds gathered spontaneously in cities thousands of miles apart. The shock extended far beyond music fans. Michael Jackson had become one of the most recognizable human beings on the planet. His death was not simply entertainment news. It felt like the sudden disappearance of a cultural landmark. Yet even as mourning began, another process was already underway. Investigators were starting to ask difficult questions. The circumstances surrounding the death did not appear simple. The more authorities examined the available evidence, the more unusual the situation seemed. What initially looked like a tragic medical emergency was gradually revealing deeper complications. Medical records, witness testimony, treatment decisions, communication gaps. Each new discovery intensified public interest. And before long, attention began focusing on one particular figure whose role during those final hours would place him at the center of a legal storm that threatened to overshadow every other aspect of the case. Because the investigation was about to move beyond the question of what happened, the next question would be far more explosive. Who, if anyone, was responsible? Years have passed since Michael Jackson's death, yet the questions surrounding that final night continue to linger in a way few celebrity stories ever do. The legal battles eventually reached their conclusions. Courtrooms examined evidence. Experts testified. Witnesses shared their versions of events. Judgments were rendered. On paper, the case appeared to move toward resolution, but public fascination never truly disappeared. Part of the reason is simple. People were not trying to understand the death of an ordinary person. They were trying to understand the final moments of someone who had occupied a unique place in global culture for decades. Michael Jackson was more than a musician. He was a symbol, a phenomenon, a figure whose influence crossed generations, languages, and national borders. When someone like that dies unexpectedly, people naturally search for explanations that feel complete. The problem is that reality rarely provides complete answers. Even after years of investigation, there are aspects of that final night that remain debated. Some people focus on the medical decisions that were made. Others focus on the pressures surrounding the planned comeback. Some point to years of physical strain, while others examine the environment that developed around him during the final stage of his life. Each perspective explains part of the story. None seem to explain all of it. Perhaps that is why the mystery continues to endure. The closer people look, the more they realize that the tragedy was not created by a single moment alone. It was the result of countless circumstances converging at exactly the wrong time. Professional pressure, personal struggles, health concerns, financial expectations, years of fame unlike anything most people could imagine. All of those factors existed long before that final night arrived. When viewed from a distance, the story becomes less about one isolated event and more about the extraordinary life that led to it, and that life remains impossible to separate from its impact. Even today, Michael Jackson's music continues to reach new audiences. Songs released decades ago are streamed millions of times every month. Young listeners discover his catalog for the first time. Old fans revisit memories attached to his performances. Documentaries continue to explore his career. Biographers continue to analyze his choices. Historians continue to debate his legacy. In many ways, his cultural presence survived the man himself. That is the paradox at the center of the story. The person disappeared. The influence did not. While the details of his final hours remain subjects of discussion, his artistic footprint continues expanding long after his death. Few entertainers in history have maintained that level of relevance across so many years. Yet perhaps the most haunting aspect of all is how close he seemed to a new chapter. A comeback tour was approaching. Rehearsals were underway. Plans were being finalized. A future was being built. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. What remains today is a story that exists somewhere between fact, tragedy, achievement, and mystery. A story that continues to fascinate because it refuses to fit neatly into a single explanation. And that may be why Michael Jackson's final night still doesn't completely make sense. Not because there are no answers, but because the answers that exist have never fully erased the questions. Decades later, the world is still trying to understand what happened during those final hours. And perhaps that search for understanding is itself part of the legacy he left behind.